If you have immigrant ancestors who came through New York in the early 1900s, you have probably heard this story. Somewhere in the family, someone will tell you that your real last name was different, longer, harder to pronounce, until an immigration officer at Ellis Island took one look at it, decided it was too foreign, and wrote down something else instead. Maybe he misheard it. Maybe he got impatient. Maybe there was a line of 1,000 people behind your great-grandfather and the clerk just didn't have time to get it right. This story exists in almost every immigrant family in America. Italian, Jewish, Polish, Greek, Irish, German, Slavic. Nearly identical versions of it, repeated for over a century, treated as an accepted piece of family history. Here is what almost nobody knows. It never happened. Not once. Not to a single documented immigrant in the entire 62-year history of Ellis Island. And when you understand why the myth exists and where it actually came from, the real story is stranger and more interesting than the legend everyone believes. 15 surnames and stories are in this video. Some belong to immigrants who really did change their names, but not the way you think. Some belong to Hollywood legends whose birth names would surprise you. And one belongs to the man who accidentally created this entire myth in a single scene of a movie that was watching everyone in America believed was history. Is your family's name change story actually true? Stay with me. Subscribe right now before we start. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. Number 1, the mechanism itself. To understand why the myth is impossible, you need to understand what actually happened at Ellis Island, and it is almost the opposite of what everyone believes. Immigration inspectors at Ellis Island never wrote down a single name. Not one. The complete list of every passenger's name was created before the ship ever left Europe, recorded by shipping company clerks at the port of departure in places like Hamburg, Naples, and Bremen, based on the travel documents each passenger already carried. Those lists, called manifests, crossed the ocean with the ship itself, organized into pages of no more than 30 names at a time, each page corresponding to a numbered clothing tag pinned to every passenger so inspectors could match the right person to the right line on the right page. When immigrants reached the front of the line inside the Great Hall at Ellis Island, an inspector was not holding a blank sheet of paper waiting to write down whatever he heard. He was holding the manifest, already filled out, and his entire job was to check the person standing in front of him against the name already recorded on the page, along with roughly 30 additional questions about health, work, and family. If anything, officials were specifically trained to correct mistakes in the manifest, not create new ones. The proof is almost embarrassingly simple once you see it. If names were being changed at the point of entry, there would be paperwork. There would be a process. There would be lists of approved replacement names and training documents for officials on how to Americanize a surname. None of that exists anywhere in the historical record, because none of it ever happened. Number 2, the interpreters nobody talks about. One of the most common versions of the myth claims that Ellis Island inspectors, unable to understand foreign languages, simply gave up and wrote down whatever sounded close enough in English. This ignores one of the best documented facts about how Ellis Island actually operated. The immigration station employed a large staff of interpreters fluent in dozens of languages, including Yiddish, Italian, Polish, and Greek, many of them immigrants or children of immigrants themselves, hired specifically because language barriers were an obvious and anticipated problem. Jewish aid organizations maintained their own offices inside the Great Hall, providing Yiddish-speaking assistance to anyone who ran into trouble with the process. The idea that a Jewish immigrant's name got mangled because nobody could understand him does not hold up against the fact that dedicated Yiddish interpreters were working in the same room. Number 3, the Frank Woodhull exception. There's exactly one well-documented case in the entire history of Ellis Island where an official did alter a name on a manifest, and it proves the rule rather than breaking it. In 1908, a passenger named Frank Woodhull arrived after years of living and working in America as a man, and was discovered during inspection to actually be a woman traveling under a male identity, born Mary Johnson. The case drew press attention at the time specifically because it was so unusual. Officials corrected the manifest to reflect her legal identity before allowing her entry, since there was no law against what she was doing, and she was cleared for admission either way. The moment Woodhull walked out of the building, she was free to use whatever name she chose again, including reverting to her male alias, because Ellis Island had no ongoing authority over what name a person used once they left the island behind. Genealogists researching this case have found no further paper trail of Woodhull under either name after she left, suggesting she likely changed her name again to avoid the publicity the incident had caused. This single documented case, involving a legal correction rather than an arbitrary change, is the closest thing that exists to evidence for the myth, and it demonstrates exactly the opposite of what the myth claims. Number 4, where the myth actually came from. If this never happened, why does almost every immigrant family in America have a version of this story? Historian Kirsten Vermaglish has traced the idea and found that it did not become a significant part of published literature until around 1970, decades after Ellis Island had already closed its doors for good in 1954. That timing matters enormously. If officials had truly been renaming immigrants throughout the station's 62 years of operation, you would expect complaints, newspaper coverage, and first-hand accounts appearing throughout that entire period. Not a story that suddenly gathers momentum in published culture nearly 2 decades after the practice supposedly stopped. The myth exploded into mainstream American consciousness through one specific, enormously influential scene. In the 1974 film The Godfather Part II, a young Sicilian boy named Vito Andolini arrives at Ellis Island and is assigned the surname Corleone by an immigration official based on his hometown because the clerk cannot process his real name. It is a beautifully shot, emotionally powerful scene. It is also complete fiction, and it single-handedly convinced an entire generation of Americans that this was simply how immigration worked. Genealogist Megan Smoleniak has pointed directly to this film, combined with what she calls immigrant grandfathers who enjoyed spinning yarns to confuse their descendants, as the two forces most responsible for cementing the myth into American family lore. Number 5. Ellis Island Special. The phrase Ellis Island Special is now used by genealogists specifically to describe a surname that a family incorrectly believes was altered by immigration officials. Many of these names cluster around Jewish immigrants whose original surnames were identifiably Jewish and whose current family names are not, feeding a version of the myth tied specifically to the idea that officials deliberately erased ethnic or religious identity at the border. Genetic and Germanic surnames spelled with certain German letters have also been cited as sources of confusion. The term itself has become so recognizable that it has been used by food vendors naming sandwiches, which tells you just how deeply this myth has embedded itself into ordinary American culture, far beyond genealogy circles. Number 6, Meyer Lansky. The organized crime figure known throughout his life as Meyer Lansky was born Meyer Sucholansky in the Russian Empire. His name is frequently cited as a supposed Ellis Island casualty, shortened and simplified by an overwhelmed immigration clerk. In reality, name changes like Lansky's followed the far more common and far better documented pattern, an immigrant or his family choosing a new name themselves. Sometime after arrival, during the process of building a new American life, often formalized years later during naturalization proceedings that required documentation of exactly this kind of change. Subscribe right now because the next 9 names and stories cover the songwriter who wrote God Bless America under a name that was never his birth name, the comedian whose entire radio and television persona was built around a name he invented himself, and the story of exactly how common this kind of self-chosen reinvention actually was in early 20th century America. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. Number 7, Irving Berlin. One of the most celebrated American songwriters in history, the man who wrote White Christmas and God Bless America, was born Israel Balin in the Russian Empire. His transformation into Irving Berlin happened gradually after his arrival in America, not at the border, but through the ordinary process of building a career and a public identity in a new country, a choice made by Berlin himself over time, rather than imposed on him in a single moment at Ellis Island. Number 8, Bob Hope. Born in England with the names Leslie Towns Hope. The entertainer who would become one of the most recognizable names in American television, film, and radio for 6 decades, made his own choices about his name as his career developed, eventually settling on the shortened, more marketable version that audiences would come to know for generations. Like nearly every other name change in this video, it happened through personal and professional decisions made after arrival, not through anything that occurred during immigration processing itself. Number 9, Rudolph Valentino. The silent film era's most famous romantic leading man arrived in America under a name almost nobody could have marketed to Hollywood audiences: Rodolfo Alfonso Raffaello Pierre Philibert Guglielmi di Valentina d'Antonguola. The shortened stage name Rudolph Valentino was a professional choice, made for an entertainment industry that needed something audiences could remember and pronounce, not a decision made by any government official at any port of entry. Number 10, Cary Grant. Born Archibald Alec Leach in England, the actor who would define an entire era of Hollywood leading men transformed his name as he transformed his career, moving from English stage acting into American film under a new identity built specifically for that new chapter of his life. His story follows the same pattern as nearly every other name change examined in this video, a personal and professional reinvention rather than anything connected to immigration processing. Number 11, Charles Atlas. Born Angelo Siciliano in Italy, the man who built one of the most recognizable fitness and bodybuilding brands in American history changed his name in 1922, years after arriving in the United States, after a friend told him he resembled the statue of Atlas that stood atop a hotel on Coney Island. The story behind this particular name change survives specifically because it was memorable and documented. Unlike the vast majority of immigrant name changes from this era, which happened quietly and left little paper trail behind them. Number 12, Rachel Maddow's family. In a widely read magazine profile, journalists traced the television personality's family history and found that her family's surname, originally Medvedev, had become Maddow sometime after immigration, a change the family itself had long attributed to an Ellis Island clerk. Even journalists at major publications have repeated this version of events without realizing it does not match the historical record, which tells you just how deeply the myth has penetrated, reaching even careful, well-researched reporting on a public figure's own family history. Number 13, the smiling clerk story. Genealogical researchers and immigration historians have documented a specific recurring type of folk story passed down in immigrant families involving an ancestor who could not speak English, was asked a question by an inspector, responded only by nodding and smiling, and was consequently assigned a surname like Smiley on the spot. Versions of this story appear across completely unrelated immigrant families from different countries and different decades, which is itself a strong sign that it functions as a piece of American folklore rather than documented individual history, closer to a shared cultural story than an actual family record. Number 14, the real reason names changed after arrival. Historical researchers point to several genuine, well-documented reasons immigrant families altered their surnames in the years following arrival, none of which involved Ellis Island itself. Employers in the early 20th century commonly discriminated against workers with names that sounded foreign, creating direct economic pressure to Americanize a surname in order to get hired, since a name alone could be enough to end a job application before it was even considered. Children entering American schools were sometimes told by administrators that their names were too long or too complicated to be entered into school records as written, forcing a change at the point of enrollment rather than at the point of immigration, a pattern documented in school registration records from immigrant neighborhoods across the country. And many immigrants simply wanted to blend into new communities and new lives, choosing new names the same way people have always used new names to mark the start of a new chapter. A deeply human impulse that had nothing to do with government bureaucracy and everything to do with the ordinary desire to belong somewhere new. Number 15, the paper trail that proves it. The single most powerful piece of evidence against the entire myth is also the simplest. Naturalization records, the legal documents immigrants filed years after arrival in order to become American citizens, frequently list both the name a person entered the country under and the name they were using at the time of naturalization. These documents exist by the thousands in the National Archives, and they show clearly and repeatedly that immigrants entered under one name lived under that same name for years, and only later, through their own choice and often through an actual legal petition, adopted the name their descendants know them by today. If Ellis Island had truly imposed new names on arrival, this paperwork would look completely different, and it does not. 15 stories. The mechanism that made the entire myth impossible from the very beginning. The interpreters, standing in the same room as every supposedly confused clerk. The one true exception that proves everyone else's name was never touched. The single movie scene that convinced an entire country something fictional was fact. The phrase now used by genealogists to name a myth their own profession fights against daily. The mobster, the songwriter, the comedian, the movie star, the bodybuilder, and the journalist's own family, all carrying the same story, and all following the same real pattern of personal reinvention that had nothing to do with the government. The folklore of the smiling immigrant, repeated so often across so many unrelated families that it stopped being anyone's specific memory and became everyone's shared myth. The real reasons names changed, sitting quietly in the historical record the whole time. And the naturalization paperwork that has been proving all of this for over a century, waiting for anyone willing to look at it. If your family has always told a story about a name changed at Ellis Island, there's a real possibility that story is not literally true, and an even better possibility that the real story, waiting in your family's naturalization records, is more interesting than the legend. The National Archives holds naturalization petitions, searchable by name and location for immigrants, processed throughout the early 20th century. The Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation maintains a free searchable database of over 65 million original passenger arrival records, letting you see your own ancestor's name exactly as it was recorded before they ever set foot in America. And Family Search offers free access to naturalization indexes covering federal and state courts throughout the country, the paper trail that shows you exactly when and why your family's name may have actually changed. The records are free. The truth has been sitting in them the entire time, and it is more interesting than the story most families have been telling for 100 years. Subscribe right now if this video changed the way you think about a story your own family has told for generations. Every week on this channel, we go this deep into the real histories behind the names and the myths that shaped American families. Subscribe, like this video, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment below. Did your family always say your name was changed at Ellis Island? Have you found the real story in the naturalization records? And was it different from what you were always told? Tell me your original surname and what you discovered. This is where the real conversations happen on this channel. Share this with every immigrant family that has been repeating this story for 100 years, because the records are free, and the real reason behind your family's name is almost always more remarkable than a story about an impatient clerk.